Right now, somewhere in America, someone is receiving a dementia diagnosis, and within the next few minutes, another person will hear those same devastating words from their doctor, and then another, because dementia is no longer a rare misfortune that strikes a handful of unlucky families. It is a full-blown epidemic rolling through this country at a pace that most people still refuse to acknowledge. And if you think it cannot touch you or the people you love, the numbers say otherwise. Because the Alzheimer's Association estimates that more than 6 million Americans are currently living with Alzheimer's disease alone, not counting the millions more affected by other forms of dementia, and that number is projected to nearly double by 2050, which means that 1 in 3 seniors who die in America today dies with Alzheimer's or another dementia listed on their death certificate, making it the condition that silently destroys more families than almost any other illness in the nation. And yet the most terrifying thing about dementia is not the disease itself but the fact that most people respond to their fear of it by doing absolutely nothing, and that paralysis, that refusal to act, is the real tragedy. Because what if I told you that nearly half of all dementia cases worldwide could be prevented or significantly delayed by changes that are entirely within your control? Not experimental drugs, not cutting-edge gene therapy, not anything that requires a prescription, but simple, daily choices about how you move your body, how you sleep, what you eat, who you spend time with, and how you challenge your brain. The kind of choices you are already making every single day, just probably in the wrong direction. And by the time you finish reading this, you will understand exactly what those choices are, why they work on a biological level, and how to start making them today, right now, without waiting for a doctor's appointment or a diagnosis or a wake-up call that comes too late. The reason most people believe dementia is an inevitable consequence of aging, a genetic time bomb that either goes off or does not, is because for decades that is exactly what the medical community believed too, but that understanding has fundamentally shifted in recent years. And the turning point came when researchers began studying people whose brains, upon autopsy, were riddled with the plaques and tangles that define Alzheimer's disease and yet who had shown no symptoms whatsoever during their lifetimes. People who had worked, socialized, managed their finances, told jokes, and lived independently right up until the end, despite carrying a brain that, under a microscope, looked like it belonged to someone in the advanced stages of cognitive decline. And when scientists compared these remarkable individuals to others whose brains showed similar levels of damage but who had deteriorated rapidly, losing their memories, their personalities, and their independence years before death, they discovered that the difference was not in the disease itself but in something the resilient brains had built up over a lifetime, a kind of neurological savings account that researchers now call cognitive reserve. And this concept has fundamentally transformed how the medical world thinks about dementia, because cognitive reserve is essentially your brain's ability to improvise, to find alternative routes when the main highway is blocked, to keep functioning even when parts of the neural network have been damaged or destroyed. And the size of your cognitive reserve is determined not by your genes alone but by how you have lived your life, the experiences you have accumulated, the challenges you have faced, the connections you have built, both social and synaptic, and perhaps most importantly, the daily habits you maintain right now, today, and every day going forward. To understand why cognitive reserve matters so much, you need to understand a little about how the brain is wired, because inside your skull there are roughly 100 billion neurons, and each of those neurons can form thousands of connections with other neurons through junctions called synapses, creating an unimaginably complex web of neural pathways that allows you to think, remember, plan, feel, speak, move, and do everything else that makes you who you are. And the density and diversity of this network is what determines your cognitive reserve. If your synaptic connections are rich, varied, and abundant, then when Alzheimer's plaques or vascular damage or any other pathology begins to erode some of those pathways, your brain has backup routes it can switch to, detour roads that keep the traffic of thought and memory flowing even though the main roads are crumbling. But if your synaptic network is sparse, if you have spent years or decades doing the same things in the same ways without challenging yourself or building new connections, then even a small amount of neural damage can cause the whole system to buckle. which is why two people can have the exact same amount of physical brain damage, and yet one of them is living at home, cooking dinner, and reading the newspaper while the other cannot remember their own children's names. And that difference, that gap between brain pathology and actual function, is the space that cognitive reserve fills. And the extraordinary news, the finding that should change how every single person in America thinks about aging, is that cognitive reserve is not fixed at birth. It is not determined solely by your education level or your IQ or your genetics. It is something you can actively build, strengthen, and expand at any age through specific, evidence-based behaviors that anyone can adopt. And the 2024 Lancet Commission on Dementia published a landmark report confirming that modifiable lifestyle factors, things you can actually change, account for approximately 45% of dementia cases worldwide, meaning that nearly half of all the dementia that exists on this planet right now could theoretically have been prevented or delayed if people had made different choices in their daily lives. And that is not wishful thinking or wellness industry marketing. That is a number backed by decades of epidemiological research, longitudinal studies, and clinical data gathered from populations across the globe. And it means that the medical community no longer views dementia as an unstoppable force of nature, but as a condition that can be managed, delayed, and in many cases prevented entirely, which brings us to the most important question anyone concerned about their brain health can ask: what exactly are those modifiable factors, and which ones deliver the biggest return on investment for your brain? The answer to that question surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time, because when most people think about protecting their brain, they think about brain games, crossword puzzles, Sudoku, memory apps, the kind of mental gymnastics that the wellness industry has spent billions of dollars marketing as the key to cognitive longevity. And while those activities are not useless, they are not even close to the most powerful tool available to you. Because the single most impactful thing you can do for your brain, according to a growing and increasingly convincing body of research, is to build and maintain your muscles, particularly the large muscles of your lower body, your quadriceps, your hamstrings, your glutes, the muscles of your thighs and hips. And the reason this matters so much has nothing to do with aesthetics or athletic performance, and everything to do with the fact that your muscles are not just mechanical structures that move your bones around. They are endocrine organs, hormone-producing factories that, when activated through resistance exercise, release a cascade of biochemical signals that travel through your bloodstream directly to your brain and trigger processes that protect neurons, promote the growth of new synaptic connections, and actively fight the biological mechanisms that cause dementia. And the two most important of these muscle-derived signals are a molecule called irisin and a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, which is sometimes referred to as Miracle-Gro for the brain because of the way it stimulates the survival, growth, and differentiation of neurons, particularly in the hippocampus, the brain region most critical for forming and storing memories and one of the first areas attacked by Alzheimer's disease. When you perform resistance exercise, when you squat, lunge, press, or even just stand up from a chair repeatedly, your muscle fibers contract and release irisin into your bloodstream, and irisin crosses the blood-brain barrier and triggers the production of BDNF in the hippocampus. And BDNF, in turn, promotes the growth of new dendritic branches on existing neurons, strengthens synaptic connections, and even stimulates the birth of entirely new neurons in a process called neurogenesis, which was once thought to be impossible in the adult brain but is now understood to occur throughout life, primarily in the hippocampus. And this is not theoretical biology. A study conducted on adults over 60 who performed resistance training twice a week for 6 months showed measurable reductions in hippocampal atrophy and significant improvements in memory test performance compared to control groups, meaning that the exercise literally changed the physical structure of their brains in a way that could be seen on imaging scans, and these muscle-derived signaling molecules, including irisin and BDNF along with dozens of others, belong to a class of substances collectively known as myokines. And a landmark paper published in the journal Nature confirmed that myokines have demonstrable positive effects on dementia prevention, cancer risk reduction, and metabolic disease management, which means that your muscles are not just holding your skeleton together. They are actively producing chemicals that keep your brain alive. And once you understand this, once you truly internalize the fact that every squat you do, every flight of stairs you climb, every time you stand up and sit down is triggering a hormonal cascade that literally feeds your brain, the way you think about exercise changes forever. Because going to the gym is no longer about looking good in clothes or losing weight or fitting into some cultural ideal of fitness. It is about building a pharmaceutical factory inside your own body that produces the most powerful brain protective drugs ever discovered, for free on demand, every time you use your muscles. The relationship between muscle strength and brain health is not a one-way street either, because as your brain becomes healthier through the effects of myokines and BDNF, it becomes better at coordinating movement, maintaining balance, and recruiting muscle fibers, which means you can exercise more effectively, which produces more myokines, which further strengthens your brain, creating a virtuous cycle that, once set in motion, builds momentum over time, meaning that the benefits compound like interest in a retirement account. Every workout you do today makes the next workout slightly more beneficial, and over months and years, this compounding effect produces dramatic differences in cognitive function and dementia risk. And this is why starting now, regardless of your current fitness level, is so critically important, because from the age of 40 onward, the average person loses approximately 1% of their muscle mass per year, and after 60 that rate accelerates significantly, which means that every year you wait is a year in which you lose ground that becomes progressively harder to recover, and if you wait until 70 to start strength training, you are not starting from the same place you would have been at 60. You are starting from a deficit that requires significantly more effort to overcome, though the good news is that it is never truly too late to begin. Because even people in their 80s and 90s have been shown to build muscle and increase BDNF production through resistance training, but the earlier you start, the larger your cognitive reserve grows, and the more protection you have when the inevitable challenges of aging begin to affect your neural pathways. The specific importance of the thigh muscles cannot be overstated in this context, because approximately 60 to 70% of your total muscle mass is concentrated in your lower body, with the quadriceps and hamstrings being the largest individual muscle groups in the entire human body, which means that exercises targeting these muscles produce disproportionately large amounts of myokines relative to the effort invested. A set of squats produces more brain protective hormones than a set of bicep curls. Not because one exercise is inherently superior, but simply because the muscles involved are so much larger. And there is a saying that has been circulating among longevity researchers and geriatric specialists that every centimeter you add to your thigh circumference is worth more than $100,000 in retirement savings. And while that sounds like hyperbole, when you calculate the average lifetime cost of dementia care in the United States, which exceeds $350,000 per patient according to the Alzheimer's Association, and when you factor in the lost income of family caregivers who have to quit their jobs or reduce their hours, and the secondary health costs that caregivers themselves incur from the physical and emotional toll of caregiving, that number starts to look not just reasonable but conservative. Because the financial destruction that dementia inflicts on American families is staggering. The national cost of caring for those with Alzheimer's and other dementias is projected to exceed $1 trillion annually within the next few decades, and that burden falls disproportionately on families, particularly on women, who make up approximately 2/3 of all unpaid dementia caregivers in this country, and who suffer higher rates of depression, anxiety, and physical illness as a result. You do not need a gym membership or expensive equipment to build the leg muscles that will protect your brain, because some of the most effective lower body exercises can be done at home with nothing but a wall and a chair. Wall sits, where you lean your back against a wall and lower yourself into a seated position and hold it for 30 seconds, then 60, then 90, progressively building the strength and endurance of your quadriceps, or chair squats, where you simply stand up and sit down from a kitchen chair 10 times, then 15, then 20, building strength through a movement pattern that your body already knows, or calf raises, where you stand on a flat surface and raise your heels off the ground and hold for a moment before lowering back down, strengthening the muscles of your lower legs and improving the balance and stability that become increasingly important as you age. And the critical point here is not intensity but consistency, because research consistently shows that 2 to 3 sessions per week of moderate resistance training, with each session targeting the major muscle groups for just 2 to 3 sets, is sufficient to produce meaningful increases in myokine production and BDNF levels. And that means you do not need to spend an hour a day in the gym, you need 10 minutes 3 times a week, doing simple movements that challenge your muscles enough to trigger the hormonal response that protects your brain. And if even that feels like too much, start with 5 minutes, start with 1 set of 10 chair squats in the morning, start with whatever you can sustain. Because the perfect routine that you abandon after 2 weeks is infinitely less valuable than the imperfect routine that you maintain for the rest of your life. And consistency, not perfection, is the principle that separates people who build lasting cognitive reserve from people who buy gym memberships in January and cancel them in March. Aerobic exercise must accompany resistance training because it protects the brain through an entirely different but equally important mechanism. And to understand why, you need to know about free radicals, which are unstable oxygen molecules that are produced constantly in your body as byproducts of normal metabolism. Every time you eat, breathe, experience stress, or sit in one position for too long, free radicals are being generated. And while your body has natural antioxidant systems to neutralize them, when production outpaces neutralization, which it does increasingly as we age, these free radicals begin to damage cells, including the neurons in your brain. And this oxidative stress is now understood to be one of the key drivers of neurodegeneration, and aerobic exercise, walking, jogging, swimming, cycling, dancing, anything that elevates your heart rate for a sustained period, dramatically enhances your body's ability to neutralize free radicals, essentially supercharging your internal antioxidant defense system and reducing the oxidative burden on your brain. And on top of that, aerobic exercise lowers blood pressure, improves cholesterol profiles, and helps regulate blood sugar levels, all of which directly reduce your risk of vascular dementia, which is the second most common form of dementia after Alzheimer's and is caused by impaired blood flow to the brain. So if resistance training is the factory that produces brain protective hormones, aerobic exercise is the cleanup crew that keeps the factory environment clean and the supply lines open. And you need both to get the full benefit, which is why the ideal exercise prescription for brain health includes both resistance training and aerobic activity, not one or the other but both, integrated into a sustainable weekly routine that you can maintain for years and decades rather than weeks and months. You do not need to run marathons or join expensive fitness classes to get the aerobic benefits that protect your brain, because walking is one of the most effective and most underestimated forms of aerobic exercise available. And the key is not speed or distance but regularity. Parking at the far end of the lot instead of circling for the closest spot, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, walking to the coffee shop instead of driving, getting off the bus 1 stop early, taking a slightly longer route home from work. These small daily choices accumulate over time into thousands of additional steps and hundreds of additional minutes of low-intensity aerobic activity that your brain registers and responds to with improved blood flow, enhanced free radical neutralization, and better regulation of the metabolic factors that contribute to vascular dementia. And the beautiful thing about walking is that it can be combined with social interaction, which, as we will discuss shortly, is itself one of the most powerful forms of brain protection available. So when you walk with a friend or a neighbor or a family member and carry on a conversation while you move, you are simultaneously engaging 3 of the 4 pillars of dementia prevention: physical movement, aerobic conditioning, and social connection, in a single, enjoyable, free, and infinitely sustainable activity that requires no special equipment, no training, and no willpower beyond the decision to put on your shoes and step outside. Sleep is the next critical pillar, and it may be the most neglected and least understood of all the factors that influence dementia risk, because while most people know that sleep is important for general health, the specific mechanism by which sleep protects your brain from dementia was only discovered in the last decade, and is so remarkable that it has fundamentally altered how neuroscientists think about the purpose of sleep itself. Because it turns out that while you are sleeping, Your brain activates a waste clearance system called the glymphatic system, which works like a dishwasher for your neural tissue. During deep sleep, the spaces between your brain cells expand by approximately 60%, and cerebrospinal fluid rushes through these expanded channels, flushing out metabolic waste products that have accumulated during the day. And the most important of these waste products, the one that makes this process directly relevant to dementia prevention, is beta amyloid, a sticky protein fragment that is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease and that, when allowed to accumulate over years and decades, clumps together into the plaques that destroy synaptic connections and kill neurons. And the glymphatic system is your brain's primary defense against this accumulation. It is the cleanup crew that removes beta amyloid before it can do lasting damage. But here is the critical catch: the glymphatic system operates almost exclusively during deep sleep, specifically during the slow-wave sleep stages that occur primarily in the first few hours of the night. And if you are not getting enough deep sleep, or if your sleep is fragmented and shallow, the glymphatic system cannot do its job, and beta amyloid begins to build up in your brain tissue. Night after night, month after month, year after year, like garbage that never gets picked up, slowly poisoning the neighborhood until the damage becomes irreversible. A research team at a major American university hospital recently developed a technique to measure glymphatic system activity in real time during sleep and confirmed that the transition into deep sleep is accompanied by significant increases in fluid flow through the frontal lobe, the brain region responsible for executive function, planning, and personality, the very functions that dementia attacks first. And longitudinal studies tracking people with chronic sleep deprivation have consistently found significantly elevated risks of dementia compared to people who sleep well. And if you have ever experienced that foggy, sluggish, cannot think straight feeling after a poor night's sleep, that is not just fatigue. That is the subjective experience of a brain that did not get cleaned, a brain that is sitting in yesterday's metabolic waste because the glymphatic system did not have enough deep sleep time to flush it out. And while one bad night will not cause dementia, thousands of bad nights might, because the damage is cumulative, and the beta amyloid that does not get cleared tonight adds to the beta amyloid that did not get cleared last night and the night before and the night before that, building layer upon layer of the very substance that causes Alzheimer's disease, which is why sleep quality may be even more important than sleep duration. You need at least 6 to 7 hours, but those hours need to include sufficient deep sleep to activate the glymphatic system. And if they do not, if your sleep is chronically shallow or interrupted, the cleaning cycle never fully engages, and your brain is accumulating damage even though you technically spent enough time in bed. Improving your sleep quality starts with one of the simplest and most impactful changes you can make: removing your smartphone from your bedroom, or at minimum putting it on silent and placing it out of arm's reach at least 1 hour before you plan to fall asleep. Because the blue light emitted by phone and tablet screens passes through your eyes and signals your brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus to suppress the production of melatonin, the hormone that regulates your sleep-wake cycle. And without adequate melatonin, you may feel tired, but your brain remains in a state of low-level arousal that prevents the transition into the deep sleep stages where glymphatic cleaning occurs. And recent research has also suggested that melatonin itself may play a direct role in activating the glymphatic system and facilitating beta amyloid clearance, which means that suppressing melatonin with evening screen time may be attacking your brain's cleaning system from two directions simultaneously, preventing deep sleep and reducing the chemical signal that triggers the cleaning process. And beyond screens, maintaining a consistent sleep schedule is one of the most effective things you can do for sleep quality, because your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that governs your sleep-wake cycle, performs best when it can predict when sleep is coming. And going to bed and waking up at roughly the same time every day, including weekends, strengthens this rhythm and makes it easier for your brain to transition quickly into the deep sleep stages that matter most for glymphatic function. And keeping your bedroom dark, cool, and quiet further supports this transition, creating an environment that your brain associates exclusively with sleep rather than with entertainment, work, or stress. Sleep apnea deserves special attention because it is dramatically underdiagnosed in the United States and is a significant independent risk factor for dementia. When you stop breathing repeatedly during the night, which is what sleep apnea causes, your brain experiences intermittent drops in oxygen that not only disrupt deep sleep and impair glymphatic function, but also cause direct oxidative damage to neurons, and over years and decades. This repeated oxygen deprivation can accelerate cognitive decline significantly. And if you snore heavily, if your partner has noticed that you stop breathing during sleep, or if you wake up feeling exhausted despite spending 8 or 9 hours in bed, you should talk to your doctor about a sleep study. Because treating sleep apnea with a CPAP machine or other interventions can dramatically improve sleep quality and may reduce your long-term dementia risk. And napping also deserves a brief mention. Short naps of 30 minutes or less have been shown to improve cognitive function and may support brain health. But longer naps that extend into deep sleep can disrupt your nighttime sleep architecture. So if you nap, set an alarm and keep it brief. The third pillar of dementia prevention is cognitive stimulation. And this is where the conversation gets particularly interesting, because the concept of neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life, means that the activities you choose to engage in on a daily basis are literally shaping the physical structure of your brain in real time. And every time you learn something new, every time you encounter an unfamiliar situation that forces you to think in a different way, new synaptic connections form between neurons. And if that new thing is interesting and engaging enough that you continue doing it, those initial connections strengthen and multiply, building out the dense, diversified neural network that constitutes cognitive reserve. And the critical insight here, the one that too many people miss, is that the activities that build cognitive reserve most effectively are not necessarily the ones that feel the most intellectually difficult. They are the ones that you genuinely enjoy, because when you engage in an activity that you find pleasurable, your brain releases dopamine. And dopamine does not just make you feel good. It acts as a neurochemical facilitator of learning and memory, enhancing the consolidation of new synaptic connections and making those connections more durable and more readily accessible, while forcing yourself to do cognitive training that you find tedious or stressful triggers the release of cortisol, which has the opposite effect, actually impairing memory formation and potentially damaging the hippocampus over time. So the counterintuitive truth about brain training is that the crossword puzzle you hate doing is probably less beneficial for your brain than the guitar you love playing, even though the crossword feels more like work. Learning to play a musical instrument is one of the most comprehensively studied and most powerfully effective cognitive activities ever identified, because playing music simultaneously engages visual processing as you read notes, auditory processing as you listen to the sounds you produce, motor coordination as you move your fingers and hands, working memory as you hold multiple pieces of information in mind at once, and emotional processing as you respond to the music's expressive content. And this simultaneous multi-domain activation creates a storm of synaptic activity across the entire brain that few other activities can match. And studies have shown that even people who begin learning an instrument later in life show measurable improvements in cognitive function, which means that the awkwardness and difficulty you experience as a beginner is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that your brain is being challenged in exactly the way it needs to be challenged to build new connections, and that challenge, that productive struggle, is what makes the activity so valuable. So if you have ever thought about picking up a guitar, sitting down at a piano, joining a community band, or learning to play the ukulele, now is the time. Not because you will become a virtuoso, but because your brain will become more resilient with every practice session. Writing is another remarkably effective form of cognitive stimulation, because the act of putting thoughts into words requires you to organize your thinking, retrieve vocabulary, construct grammatical sentences, and maintain a coherent narrative thread, all of which engages multiple brain regions simultaneously. Keeping a journal, writing letters, summarizing books you have read, or simply writing down what happened during your day forces your brain to do the kind of integrative processing that strengthens synaptic connections and builds cognitive reserve. And cooking, surprisingly, is one of the best brain workouts available. Because preparing a meal requires you to plan a sequence of steps, hold a recipe in working memory, manage multiple tasks simultaneously as you chop vegetables while monitoring something on the stove, make real-time adjustments to timing and seasoning, and integrate sensory information from taste, smell, sight, and touch. It is executive function, working memory, sensory integration, and motor coordination all rolled into a single enjoyable activity. And the more you challenge yourself with new recipes and unfamiliar techniques, the more powerful the cognitive stimulus becomes. But of all the cognitive activities that build reserve, social interaction stands in a category by itself, because having a conversation with another human being is, from your brain's perspective, one of the most complex and demanding tasks it can perform. When you talk to someone, you are simultaneously processing their words for meaning, interpreting their tone of voice and facial expressions for emotional content, accessing your own memories and knowledge to formulate a response, planning what you want to say, monitoring the other person's reactions to adjust your approach in real time, and managing the social rules and expectations that govern human interaction. All of this happens automatically, below your conscious awareness. And it activates neural networks across virtually every region of your brain in a way that no puzzle, no app, no solo activity can replicate. And this is why study after study has found that people with rich social networks, people who regularly interact with friends, family, and community members, have significantly lower rates of dementia than people who are socially isolated, and why elderly people who live alone and have limited social contact show faster rates of cognitive decline than their more socially connected peers. The brain, like a muscle, needs to be used to stay strong, and social interaction is the most comprehensive workout it can get, which means that meeting a friend for coffee, chatting with your neighbor over the fence, joining a book club, volunteering at a food bank, attending a community event, or simply calling someone on the phone and talking for 20 minutes is not just a pleasant way to spend time. It is an active investment in your cognitive future, a deposit into the neural savings account that will determine whether you can live independently at 80 or whether you will need full-time care. Volunteering and joining clubs or community groups are particularly valuable because they combine social interaction with shared purpose, which adds additional layers of cognitive engagement. When you work with others toward a common goal, you are not just socializing but also planning, coordinating, problem-solving, teaching, learning, and adapting, all of which create rich, complex patterns of neural activation that build cognitive reserve more effectively than passive social contact alone. And the opposite of all this, the behavior pattern that is most damaging to your brain, is isolation combined with routine, sitting alone at home day after day, doing the same things in the same order without any novelty or social contact. This is the cognitive equivalent of putting your brain in a dark closet, and if you add physical inactivity to that equation, you have created the perfect conditions for accelerated cognitive decline, which is why the single worst thing you can do for your brain is nothing, literally nothing, sitting still, alone, in familiar surroundings, letting the days blur together without challenge, stimulation, or human connection. And even small disruptions to this pattern can make a meaningful difference. Walking a different route, visiting a store you have never been to, striking up a conversation with a stranger, trying a recipe from a cuisine you have never cooked. Anything that introduces even a modest amount of novelty into your day is a signal to your brain that it needs to stay alert, stay flexible, and keep building new connections. Negative thinking and chronic stress are enemies of brain health that deserve explicit attention, because when you habitually engage in negative rumination, replaying conflicts, criticizing yourself, worrying about the future, resenting others, your brain responds by producing cortisol, the primary stress hormone, and while cortisol is essential in small doses for the fight-or-flight response that kept our ancestors alive, chronic cortisol elevation is toxic to the brain, particularly to the hippocampus, where cortisol receptors are densely concentrated, and prolonged exposure to elevated cortisol levels has been shown to shrink the hippocampus, impair memory formation, and reduce the production of BDNF, effectively reversing the benefits of exercise and accelerating the very processes that lead to dementia. And this means that stress management is not a luxury or a self-help indulgence. It is a medical necessity for anyone who wants to protect their brain, and the most accessible stress management tools are also the simplest, deep breathing exercises. Even just 5 minutes of slow, deliberate breathing have been shown to reduce cortisol levels and activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes rest and recovery, and meditation, even in its most basic form of sitting quietly and focusing on your breath for 10 minutes a day, has been associated with strengthened prefrontal cortex function and reduced amygdala reactivity, which translates to better emotional regulation, less impulsive stress responses, and lower baseline cortisol levels. And you do not need an app or a class or a retreat. You need a quiet chair and a willingness to sit still and breathe. And if you do this consistently, you are not just reducing stress, you are actively protecting your hippocampus from the cortisol-driven damage that accelerates cognitive decline. Gratitude is another underappreciated tool for brain health, because the conscious practice of identifying things you are thankful for triggers the release of dopamine and serotonin, neurotransmitters that stabilize mood, enhance memory consolidation, and improve focus and concentration. And people who maintain a regular gratitude practice, something as simple as thinking of 3 things they are grateful for before bed each night, show measurable differences in brain function compared to those who do not. And this is not soft psychology or wishful thinking, it is neurochemistry. And it works because your brain cannot simultaneously produce high levels of cortisol and high levels of dopamine. So by deliberately activating the gratitude circuitry, you are physiologically suppressing the stress circuitry, giving your hippocampus a break from cortisol exposure and creating conditions that favor memory formation and synaptic growth. Diet plays a supporting but important role in the overall brain health equation. And while the topic of nutrition can quickly become overwhelming, the core principles for brain protective eating are straightforward. Reduce your intake of processed foods, refined sugars, and saturated fats, which promote inflammation and oxidative stress, and increase your consumption of vegetables, especially leafy greens, which are rich in antioxidants that neutralize the free radicals we discussed earlier, along with nuts and fatty fish like salmon and mackerel, which contain omega-3 fatty acids that are essential components of neuronal cell membranes and that support healthy synaptic function. And the gut-brain axis also deserves mention because your gut and your brain are connected by the vagus nerve and communicate constantly through chemical signals. And a healthy gut microbiome, supported by a diverse diet rich in fiber and fermented foods, has been associated with better cognitive function and lower inflammation, while an unhealthy gut, characteristic of diets high in sugar and processed foods, has been linked to increased brain inflammation and elevated dementia risk. And for people with diabetes or high blood pressure, managing these conditions is especially critical, because chronic blood sugar instability damages the small blood vessels in the brain and significantly increases the risk of vascular dementia. And chronic hypertension has a similar effect, causing cumulative damage to cerebral microvasculature that eventually manifests as cognitive decline. And you do not need to overhaul your entire diet overnight. Adding 1 extra serving of vegetables to your dinner, choosing a handful of almonds instead of chips for your afternoon snack, swapping 1 soda for water. These small substitutions, maintained consistently, gradually shift your body's biochemical environment in a direction that supports brain health rather than undermining it. Bringing all of this together, the architecture of dementia prevention rests on 4 interconnected pillars. Resistance training focused on the large muscles of the lower body combined with regular aerobic exercise to produce myokines and BDNF while reducing oxidative stress and cardiovascular risk factors. Deep restorative sleep that activates the glymphatic system and clears beta amyloid from the brain. Cognitively stimulating activities and rich social connections that build and maintain diverse synaptic networks. And a brain-supportive diet that reduces inflammation and provides the raw materials for healthy neural function. And these 4 pillars do not operate independently. They form a synergistic system in which each element amplifies the others, because the BDNF produced by your leg muscles during a morning workout strengthens the synaptic connections that your evening conversation with a friend helped create. And the deep sleep you get that night flushes out the metabolic waste that accumulated during the day while consolidating the memories and learning from your new experiences. And the nutrients from the salmon and spinach you had for dinner provide the omega-3 fatty acids and antioxidants that protect the newly formed synapses from oxidative damage. And when all four pillars are working together, the compound effect over months and years is a brain that is denser, more connected, more resilient, and better equipped to withstand the pathological changes that aging inevitably brings. One of the reasons people struggle to sustain these behaviors is that the benefits are invisible in the short term. When you work out at the gym, you can see your muscles grow over weeks and months. But you cannot see your hippocampus getting larger or your synaptic density increasing or your beta amyloid levels dropping. And this invisibility makes it easy to skip a workout, to stay up late scrolling your phone, to eat the fast food instead of cooking, to cancel plans with friends because you are tired, and each of those individual choices seems harmless in the moment, but they are not harmless. They are compound interest working in reverse. Tiny incremental losses that accumulate silently over years until the day you notice that you cannot remember where you put your keys, and then that you cannot remember your neighbor's name, and then that you cannot remember how to get home from the store, and by then, the damage has been decades in the making, which is why the time to act is now. Not when symptoms appear, not when a doctor gives you a warning, not when someone you love gets diagnosed. Now, today, this moment, because every squat you do today, every good night of sleep you get tonight, every friend you call this week, every new recipe you try this month is a brick in the wall that will stand between you and cognitive decline 20 years from now. And you cannot see that wall being built, but it is being built, synapse by synapse, connection by connection, one small choice at a time. If you or someone in your family has already received a dementia diagnosis, there are still critically important things you can do, because social isolation accelerates cognitive decline more powerfully than almost any other factor. And multiple studies have consistently shown that emotional support, social engagement, and maintaining daily routines that include human interaction can meaningfully slow the progression of symptoms. And the person living with dementia still has feelings, still responds to kindness, still experiences joy and comfort and connection, even if they express these things differently than they once did. And the most important thing a family member can do is let go of comparisons to who the person used to be and meet them where they are right now, in this moment. Because if your mother is behaving like a child, it may be because her cognitive function has returned to that developmental stage, and trying to correct her or remind her of who she used to be creates confusion and distress for both of you. While accepting her current reality and responding to her with warmth and patience creates moments of genuine connection that have therapeutic value beyond anything a medication can provide. And caregivers must also protect their own health, because the stress of caregiving has been shown to increase the caregiver's own risk of developing dementia, and trying to do everything alone is not heroism. It is a recipe for burnout that ultimately harms both you and the person you are caring for. And there are resources available through local aging services, the Alzheimer's Association, adult daycare programs, respite care services, and community support groups that can provide relief and allow you to sustain your caregiving role over the long term without sacrificing your own health and cognitive function in the process. Dementia is not an inevitable sentence handed down by your genes or your age. It is a condition that responds to how you live, what you do, and the choices you make every single day. And the science is now clear enough, the evidence strong enough, the mechanisms well enough understood, that there is no longer any excuse for passivity. No justification for sitting on the couch hoping that dementia skips your house. Because hope is not a strategy, but squatting is, and sleeping well is, and calling your friend is, and learning something new is, and eating your vegetables is. And each of these small, unglamorous, entirely achievable acts is a declaration that you refuse to surrender your mind to a disease that you have the power to fight, starting right now, starting today, starting with the next decision you make about how to spend the next 10 minutes of your life.